Greetings, traveller. The twilight hour settled over the ancient forest like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the gentle symphony of evening creatures stirring to life. Elowen sat at the edge of the hidden pond, her bare feet dangling in the cool water as she held her fishing line with practiced patience. This was her favorite time of day, when the boundary between day and night grew thin and the world seemed to hold its breath in quiet anticipation. She had lived alone in her small cottage for as long as she could remember, nestled between towering oaks and silver birches whose roots drank deeply from the pond's clear waters. The forest provided everything she needed: fish from the pond, mushrooms and berries from the undergrowth, herbs for healing and seasoning. It was a simple life, but one that brought her contentment in its predictable rhythms. The fishing line tugged gently in her hands, and Elowen smiled. The evening catch was always the most rewarding, as if the fish themselves were drawn to the peaceful transition between light and shadow. She began to reel in her line, expecting to see the familiar silver flash of a pond trout breaking the surface. Instead, something dark and heavy emerged from the depths, wrapped around her hook like a sleeping creature reluctant to wake. Elowen frowned, carefully lifting the object from the water. It was not a fish at all, but a small talisman of polished black stone, roughly the size of her palm and perfectly smooth except for the intricate runes carved into its surface. As the water dripped away, the runes seemed to shimmer with an inner light that was barely perceptible in the gathering dusk. Elowen held the talisman closer, studying the unfamiliar symbols that spiraled across its surface in patterns that seemed almost alive. The stone felt warm against her palm, warmer than it should have been after resting in the cool pond water. She had never seen anything like it before. In all her years of fishing this pond, she had pulled up nothing more unusual than the occasional waterlogged branch or smooth river stone. This felt different, ancient, purposeful, as if it had been waiting in the depths for exactly this moment to be found. The last light of day faded as Elowen made her way back to her cottage, the mysterious talisman tucked safely in her pocket. Her small home stood in a clearing just large enough for a vegetable garden and a few herb beds, its walls built from the same weathered stone as the ancient tree's roots. Ivy climbed the walls in gentle cascades, and wildflowers grew freely around the doorstep, creating a harmony between dwelling and forest that felt as natural as breathing. Inside, Elowen lit her oil lamps and placed the talisman on her wooden table, studying it more carefully in the steady lamplight. The runes were definitely carved by intelligent hands, each symbol precisely etched and connected to the others in flowing, deliberate patterns. Some resembled doorways or gateways, while others looked like celestial bodies or abstract representations of balance and transition. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the slight depression of each carved line. The warmth she had noticed earlier seemed to pulse gently, like a slow heartbeat beneath the stone. It was beautiful in its mystery, but also somehow unsettling. Objects did not simply appear in her pond, especially objects that seemed to possess their own subtle energy. After a simple dinner of fresh fish, wild greens and herb bread, Elowen wrapped the talisman in a soft cloth and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table. Whatever it was whatever purpose it might serve, could wait until morning. The forest had taught her patience above all things, and she had learned to trust in the natural unfolding of time. Her cottage settled into its nighttime quiet, filled with the soft sounds of the forest beyond her walls. Elowen had always slept peacefully here, lulled by the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures going about their ancient business. Tonight should have been no different. But sometime in the deep hours before dawn, she awakened. The room around her was filled with an ethereal green glow, soft but unmistakably present. Elowen sat up slowly, her heart beating with sudden awareness as her eyes found the source of the light. The talisman was floating several inches above her bedside table, the drawer somehow open beneath it, and the stone itself was radiating that gentle green luminescence like a captured piece of aurora. She remained perfectly still, watching in fascination rather than fear. The light pulsed in that same slow rhythm she had felt earlier, and as she observed more closely, she realized the pulsing seemed to match her own heartbeat. When she breathed more, quickly the light responded, brightening slightly. When she consciously slowed her breathing, the glow dimmed to a softer whisper. The talisman was responding to her presence, somehow attuned to her life force in ways she could not begin to understand. This was no ordinary object, no simple decorative stone lost by some traveler. This was something far older and more significant than anything she had encountered in her quiet forest life. Elowen slowly extended her hand toward the floating talisman. As her fingers drew near, the green glow intensified, and she felt a gentle warmth radiating from the stone. The moment her skin made contact with its surface, images flashed briefly through her mind. Glimpses of towering structures, robed figures, and symbols that matched the runes carved into the talisman's face. The visions lasted only seconds before fading, leaving her with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. This talisman was connected to something much larger than herself, something that had been waiting in the depths of her peaceful pond for reasons she could not fathom. She gently took the talisman in her hands, and it settled immediately back into its solid, non-floating state, though the warm pulse continued against her palms. Elowen wrapped it again in the soft cloth and returned it to the drawer, but sleep did not come easily for the remainder of the night. By morning, she had made her decision. The talisman's appearance in her life was not coincidence, and its mysterious properties demanded investigation. She could not simply ignore such a significant discovery and return to her normal routines as if nothing had changed. The forest had taught her to pay attention to signs and to trust her instincts, and every instinct told her that this talisman was the beginning of something important. After her morning meal and a brief walk to tend her garden, Elowen prepared for a journey she had not made in several months. There was someone who might be able to help her understand what she had found, though reaching him would require a day's travel through the forest to the old tower that stood at the boundary between the wild woods and the cultivated lands beyond. The wizard Aldrich had lived in that tower for as long as anyone could remember, a solitary scholar who studied the old magics and maintained extensive libraries of ancient lore. Elowen had met him several times over the years when she ventured to the village market to trade her fish and foraged goods for supplies she could not make herself. He was elderly but sharp-minded, with a reputation for knowledge that stretched back to the founding days of the nearby settlements. If anyone could identify the talisman and explain its properties, it would be Aldrich. Elowen packed a simple travel bag with food, water, and basic supplies, then carefully wrapped the talisman and tucked it into a secure inner pocket of her cloak. The morning was bright and clear, perfect for forest travel, and she set out along the familiar paths with the confident stride of one who had walked these woods for most of her life. The forest revealed its beauty gradually as she travelled, each bend in the path offering new arrangements of light and shadow, new combinations of flowering plants and ancient trees. She passed through groves of silver birch where the sunlight created intricate patterns on the forest floor, crossed babbling streams on moss-covered stones, and paused occasionally to identify useful herbs or simply to appreciate the peaceful abundance surrounding her. This was her world, the place where she felt most herself and most connected to the natural rhythms that had always guided her life. Yet today, with the mysterious talisman resting against her heart, even familiar sights seemed touched with new significance. She found herself noticing details she had previously overlooked. Standing stones half hidden by undergrowth, carved symbols on ancient tree trunks, clearings arranged in patterns too perfect to be entirely natural. Had these signs always been present, or was the talisman somehow heightening her awareness of the magical currents that flowed through the forest? She could not say, but the sensation of walking between worlds, between the mundane and the mystical, grew stronger with each step toward Aldrich's tower. The old wizard's tower came into view as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It stood tall and weathered against the sky, built from the same grey stone as the ancient foundations scattered throughout the forest. Ivy and climbing roses softened its austere lines, and smoke rose gently from the chimney, indicating that Aldrich was home and tending his evening fire. Elowen approached the heavy wooden door and knocked with the brass ring that served as a doorbell. The sound echoed hollowly within the tower's stone walls, followed by the shuffle of footsteps on a spiral staircase. After several minutes, the door swung open to reveal Aldrich himself, a tall, thin man with snow-white hair and beard, wearing robes of deep blue that seemed to shimmer slightly in the fading daylight. "Elowen," he said with genuine pleasure, his lined face creasing into a smile. "It has been some time since you've come this way. What brings you to my tower on such a lovely evening?" "I have found something, Master Aldrich," she replied, using the respectful title that felt appropriate when seeking his scholarly assistance. "Something I cannot identify, and I hoped you might be able to help me understand what it is." His pale eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed. Please come in. Let us see what mystery the forest has revealed to you." The interior of Aldrich's tower was exactly as Elowen remembered, filled with the comfortable clutter of a dedicated scholar. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Scrolls were stacked on every available surface, and strange instruments for astronomical observation occupied the spaces between overstuffed chairs and small tables. The air smelled pleasantly of parchment, herbs, and the lingering smoke from his fireplace. Aldrich gestured for her to sit in a cushioned chair near the fire, then settled himself across from her with the careful movements of advanced age. "Now then," he said, folding his hands in his lap, "show me this mysterious discovery." Elowen carefully unwrapped the talisman and placed it on the small table between them. Even in the firelight, the runes seemed to possess their subtle inner glow, and the stone's warmth was immediately noticeable in the cooler air of the tower room. Aldrich leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp attention. He did not touch the talisman immediately, but studied it intently from several angles, his eyes tracing the carved patterns with the focused gaze of one who recognized what he was seeing. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of concern that had not been present moments before. "In my pond, while fishing last evening," Elowen replied. "It was caught on my hook, as if it had been resting on the bottom and chose that moment to be found." Aldrich nodded slowly, then extended one finger to touch the talisman's surface. The moment his skin made contact, the green glow intensified noticeably, and his eyes widened with what looked like recognition mixed with alarm. "These runes," he murmured, withdrawing his hand quickly. "I have seen their like before, in the oldest texts. This is no ordinary artifact, my dear Elowen. This is something that should not exist in our current age." The wizard rose and moved to one of his bookcases, running his finger along the spines of ancient volumes until he found what he sought. He pulled out a thick tome, bound in cracked leather, and began turning its yellowed pages with careful precision. "Here," he said finally, pointing to a page covered with symbols that clearly matched those on the talisman. "These are the sacred runes of Vaelor, an ancient deity whose worship ended thousands of years ago. But this particular combination of symbols—" He trailed off, studying both the book and the talisman with growing unease. "What do they mean?" Elowen asked, though she sensed from his manner that the answer might be more complicated than she was prepared for. Aldrich closed the book gently and returned to his chair, his expression troubled. "They speak of thresholds, of gateways between what is and what might be. Vaelor was the god of balance, of transitions, of the spaces between certainty and mystery. His followers believed that true wisdom came from understanding the delicate equilibrium that holds our world together." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But there were also darker aspects to Vaelor's domain, powers that were deemed too dangerous for mortal understanding. The worship of Vaelor was not forbidden lightly. Elowen, it ended because something went wrong, something significant enough that all records of the specific details were deliberately destroyed." The talisman pulsed gently on the table between them, as if responding to the mention of its divine origins. Elowen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What should I do with it?" she asked. "Should I return it to the pond? Try to bury it somewhere safe?" Aldrich shook his head slowly. "I fear it may be too late for such simple solutions. The fact that it revealed itself to you, that it responds to your presence so clearly, suggests that some ancient process has already begun. These artifacts do not surface randomly, my dear. They appear when they are needed, or when their time of concealment has ended." He stood again, this time moving to a window that looked out over the forest toward the distant lights of human settlements. "There is someone you must speak with, someone whose knowledge of these ancient matters exceeds my own. In the city of Varenth, in the Magic Quarter, you will find the High Arcanist. If anyone can tell you the full truth about what you have found, it will be her." Elowen carefully wrapped the talisman again, feeling its warmth through the layers of cloth. "Varenth is far from here. I have never traveled so far from the forest." "I know," Aldrich said gently, turning back to face her. "But I believe this choice may no longer be entirely yours to make. The talisman has chosen you, for whatever purpose the ancient powers intended. Fighting against such a selection rarely ends well." As if to emphasize his words, the wrapped talisman pulsed more strongly, its glow visible even through the concealing cloth. Elowen felt a strange certainty settling over her, a recognition that her quiet life among the trees had just transformed into something far more complex and consequential. She spent the night in Aldrich's tower, in a comfortable guest room he maintained for the occasional traveler. But sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of doorways opening onto landscapes she did not recognize, and voices speaking in languages she could not understand, but somehow knew were discussing her future. By morning, her decision was made. She would travel to Varenth and seek the High Arcanist's counsel. The talisman had entered her life for a reason, and that reason would not be satisfied by attempts to ignore or abandon what had been begun. The forest life she had always known was changing, guided by forces older than memory, and she could only trust that the same wisdom that had sustained her among the trees would serve her in whatever lay ahead. The journey to Varenth took 3 days of steady travel, leading Elowen farther from the forest than she had ever ventured before. Each mile carried her deeper into landscapes that felt increasingly foreign. Rolling farmland where the wild abundance of the woods gave way to ordered rows of crops. Then bustling trade roads where merchants' wagons raised clouds of dust that settled uncomfortably on her forest-trained senses. The talisman remained quiet during the daylight hours, resting against her heart like a warm stone. But each night it awakened with that same ethereal glow. Elowen learned to wrap it in multiple layers of cloth before seeking lodging at roadside inns, though she still caught curious glances from other travelers who seemed to sense something unusual about the solitary woman who spoke softly and moved with the fluid grace of someone more accustomed to navigating root-tangled paths than cobblestone streets. Varenth revealed itself gradually as she crested the final hill before the city walls. It spread across the valley floor like a vast tapestry woven from stone and timber, with towers reaching toward the sky and smoke from countless chimneys creating a hazy canopy overhead. The sheer number of people moving along the roads and through the gates was overwhelming too. Someone who could count the human faces she had seen in the past year on both hands. The guards at the city entrance barely glanced at her travel papers, more interested in the loaded merchant wagons that promised customs fees than in a quietly dressed woman with forest mud still clinging to her boots. Elowen passed through the gates and found herself immediately surrounded by a symphony of urban life. Voices calling out prices for goods she had never seen, wheels rattling over stone, and the constant underlying hum of thousands of people pursuing their daily business. She made her way through the crowded streets by following the signs that pointed toward the magic quarter, though the talisman seemed to pull her in the same direction with its own subtle insistence. The buildings grew taller and more ornate as she progressed, their architecture incorporating flowing curves and impossible angles that suggested the influence of magical craftsmanship. The magic quarter itself was unlike anything Elowen had imagined. The very air seemed to shimmer with residual enchantments, and shops displayed wares that defied natural law, flowers that bloomed in mid-air without soil or water, mirrors that reflected rooms different from the ones they occupied, and books whose pages turned themselves while floating just beyond their reader's reach. The arcanist's tower stood at the quarter's heart, a graceful spire of white stone that seemed to twist gently as it rose, creating an optical illusion that made it difficult to determine exactly how tall it truly was. Crystalline formations grew from its walls like frozen waterfalls, and the large windows showed glimpses of rooms where starlight seemed to shine regardless of the time of day. Elowen approached the entrance with growing nervousness. The massive doors were carved from what appeared to be a single piece of deep green stone, covered with protective symbols that seemed to shift and change when she was not looking. Directly at them, a brass plate beside the doors simply read, "Seriana Moonweaver, High Arcanist of Varinth, Knowledge Seekers welcome by appointment." She pressed the small crystal button below the nameplate and immediately felt a gentle, probing sensation in her mind, as if someone was carefully determining her intentions without actually reading her thoughts. After a moment, the doors swung silently inward, revealing a reception chamber lit by floating orbs of soft golden light. A young man in robes of silvery grey looked up from a desk covered with appointment ledgers and correspondence. "Good afternoon," he said with professional courtesy. "Do you have business with the High Arcanist?" "I was told she might be able to help me understand something I found," Elowen replied, her hand unconsciously moving to where the talisman rested beneath her cloak. "Master Aldrich of the Forest Tower sent me here." The assistant's eyebrows rose with interest. "Ah, Master Aldrich, the High Arcanist always makes time for his referrals. May I ask the nature of your inquiry?" Elowen hesitated, then carefully withdrew the wrapped talisman. Even through the layers of cloth, its presence seemed to affect the magical atmosphere of the chamber. The floating lights dimmed slightly, and she heard the assistant draw in a sharp breath. "I see," he said quietly. "Please wait here for just a moment." He disappeared through a doorway behind his desk, and Elowen heard the faint sound of hurried conversation from the floors above. Within minutes, he returned with a woman who could only be the High Arcanist herself. Seriana Moonweaver was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked dark hair braided with small crystals that caught the light as she moved. Her robes were deep midnight blue, embroidered with constellations that seemed to shift position like a real night sky, and her eyes held the penetrating intelligence of someone who had spent decades studying the deepest mysteries of magical practice. "Master Aldrich's message arrived by crystal whisper an hour ago," she said without preamble, her gaze fixed on the wrapped bundle in Elowen's hands. "He told me to expect you, though he provided few details about what you carry. May I see it?" Elowen unwrapped the talisman carefully, placing it on the assistant's desk. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Every magical object in the chamber responded to its presence. The floating lights flared brighter. Several crystal paperweights began to hum in harmonic frequencies, and a bowl of scrying water on a nearby shelf started to ripple in perfect concentric circles. The high arcanist leaned closer, her expression shifting from professional interest to genuine amazement. "Blessed stars," she whispered, "this is not possible. These were lost thousands of years ago." "You recognize it?" Elowen asked, though the answer was clearly written in the arcanist's stunned expression. "Recognize it? My dear woman, you are holding one of the three talismans of Vaelor. I have spent half my life studying references to these artifacts, never believing I would actually see one." Seriana straightened, her manner becoming more formal. "We must speak privately. Jorik, cancel my remaining appointments and ensure we are not disturbed." The assistant nodded, already moving to reorganize the day's schedule as the High Arcanist led Elowen up a spiral staircase that seemed to climb much higher than the tower's exterior dimensions should have allowed. They emerged into a circular chamber lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large table covered with star charts and magical instruments. "Please, sit," Seriana said, gesturing to a comfortable chair beside the table. "Tell me exactly how you came to possess this talisman." Elowen recounted the story of finding the artifact in her pond, its strange behavior during the night, and her journey to seek answers. The High Arcanist listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of parchment covered with symbols that wrote themselves in response to her gestures. "The legends speak of 3 talismans," Seriana said when Elowen had finished, "created by the priests of Vaelor in the final days before his worship was forbidden. Each talisman contains a fragment of the god's power, and together they serve as keys to his sealed temple." She moved to one of the bookshelves, withdrawing a volume bound in scales that shimmered like oil on water. Vaelor was the god of thresholds and balance, but also of hidden knowledge and dangerous truths. His temple was sealed not to keep people out, but to keep something in. The records from that time are fragmentary and contradictory, but they all agree on one point. The sealing was necessary to prevent a catastrophe that would have affected the fundamental structure of reality itself. The talisman pulsed gently on the table, as if responding to the discussion of its origins. Elowen felt that familiar warmth against her awareness, but now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of urgency, of time running short for some purpose she could not yet understand. "What happens if the 3 talismans are brought together?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would only deepen the mystery. According to the texts, they would unseal Vaelor's temple and grant access to whatever lies within. But the location of that temple was hidden so thoroughly that no one has found even a trace of it in over 3,000 years. Seriana paused, studying Elowen with calculating eyes. The appearance of one talisman after so long suggests that the others may be stirring as well. These artifacts do not act independently. They are part of a larger pattern a purpose that was set in motion long before any of us were born. The High Arcanist stood and walked to one of the tall windows, gazing out over the city with an expression of deep concern. "There is something else you should know. You are not the first person to come to me with questions about Vaelor in recent months. The second talisman surfaced 6 weeks ago, purchased by an alchemist named Marek, who specializes in magical antiquities. He brought it here for identification, much as you have done." Elowen felt her heart skip slightly. "Where is it now?" "Still in his possession, as far as I know. Marek lives in the old district, near the alchemical college. He was quite secretive about his plans for the artifact, but he seemed to understand its significance better than he was willing to admit." Seriana turned back to face Elowen directly. "If you are truly committed to understanding what you have begun, you will need to speak with him. The talismans are stronger together than apart, and I suspect yours will continue to grow more active until it is reunited with its companions." As if to confirm her words, the talisman's pulse intensified, and Elowen felt a strange tugging sensation, as if something was calling to it from across the city. The connection was faint but unmistakable. Somewhere in Varinth, another piece of this ancient puzzle was waiting. "Will you help me find him?" Elowen asked. "I will do more than that," Seriana replied. "I will provide you with a letter of introduction and my personal assurance that your intentions are scholarly rather than mercenary. Marek is particular about the people he deals with. He has had unfortunate experiences with treasure hunters and those who seek power for its own sake." The High Arcanist spent the next hour copying relevant passages from her ancient texts and preparing detailed notes about the known history of Vaelor's worship. She also provided Elowen with a small silver pendant that would protect her from hostile magic and a crystal vial containing what she called emergency clarity, a potion that would help focus the mind in situations where magical influences might cloud judgment. "One more thing," Seriana said as she handed over the sealed letter for Marek. "If you do succeed in finding all 3 talismans, do not attempt to use them without understanding their full purpose. The power to unseal what the ancients deemed necessary to hide is not something to wield lightly. Come back to me before you make any final decisions." Elowen left the Arcanist's tower as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The city felt different now, not just foreign, but charged with hidden significance. Every face in the crowd might belong to someone connected to the mystery she had stumbled into. Every building might conceal artifacts or knowledge related to the ancient god whose talisman she carried. Finding Marek's residence required asking directions from several shopkeepers in the alchemical district, but the name was well known among those who dealt in rare magical components. He lived in a narrow house wedged between a store selling crystallized moonbeams and a workshop where enchanted tools repaired themselves when their owners were not looking. The house itself was unremarkable except for the strong protective wards that made the air around it feel thick and resistant. Elowen knocked on the heavy wooden door and waited, aware that she was being observed through magical means, even though no windows faced the street. After several minutes, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with prematurely grey hair and ink-stained fingers. He was shorter than Elowen by several inches, but his presence filled the doorway with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with powers that demanded respect. "You're not here about the standard reagents," he said without preamble, his sharp eyes taking in details about her appearance and bearing. "Forest-born, I would guess. Probably carrying something that's been making the local magic act strangely. Let me see the letter." Elowen handed him Seriana's sealed introduction, impressed by his perceptiveness. Marek broke the wax seal with a gesture that also dispelled several minor protective enchantments, then read the contents with growing interest. "Seriana says you have the first talisman," he said finally, looking up from the letter. "The one that went missing from recorded history over 3 millennia ago. That would explain why my peace has been so restless lately. You have the second one." "I do indeed. Acquired it from an estate sale where the previous owner clearly had no idea what they possessed. It's been floating around my study and glowing like a captured star for weeks now." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in then. Let's see what happens when we put them in the same room." Marek's house was a fascinating maze of alchemical equipment, rare books, and carefully organized collections of magical components. Every surface held something interesting: bottled essences, crystallized emotions, preserved specimens of creatures that existed only in the spaces between dimensions. The air smelled of exotic spices, ozone, and the indefinable scent that lingered around powerful enchantments. He led her to his study, a room lined with glass cases containing his most valuable acquisitions. In the center of the room, floating above a pedestal of black marble, was the second talisman. It was identical to Elowen's in size and shape, but carved from white stone that seemed to glow with internal starlight. The runes covering its surface were different but clearly related, and the moment Elowen's talisman came within range, both artifacts began to pulse in perfect synchronization. "Remarkable," Marek murmured, watching as the two talismans slowly rotated to face each other despite being held and displayed separately. "They're definitely awakening. The question is whether we're prepared for what comes next." Elowen unwrapped her talisman completely, and the reaction intensified. Both stones rose from their positions, floating at chest height and beginning to orbit around each other in a slow, graceful dance. The green and white lights they emitted began to blend where they overlapped, creating patterns of color that hurt to look at directly, but were beautiful beyond description. "According to my research," Marek said, pulling a leather journal from a nearby shelf, "the third talisman was lost over a century ago when a treasure hunter named Keltan disappeared into the deep forest ruins. His notes mentioned hiring a goblin guide called Skrit, but neither of them ever returned to civilization." "And you think this Skrit might still have it?" "Goblins live longer than humans, and they're notorious for hoarding interesting objects. If the third talisman ended up in goblin hands, it's probably still there." Marek closed his journal and looked directly at Elowen. "But there's something you need to understand about my willingness to cooperate in this venture." He gestured around his study, and for the first time Elowen noticed signs of disturbance, scorch marks on the walls, furniture pushed hastily aside, and what looked like claw marks scored deep into the wooden floor. Ever since I acquired my talisman, I've been dealing with an infestation problem. Creatures are drawn to the magical emanations, and they're not the sort that respond to conventional pest control. If you want my cooperation in finding the third piece, you'll need to help me solve my immediate crisis. As if summoned by his words, a skittering sound emerged from the walls around them. It was followed by chittering noises and the scratch of claws on wood, suggesting that whatever lived in the hidden spaces of Marek's house was both numerous and active. What kind of creatures? Elowen asked, though she suspected the answer would be unpleasant. Rats, Marek replied grimly, but not ordinary rats. These have been changed by prolonged exposure to magical fields, grown large and cunning and hungry for sources of power. They have taken over my cellar completely, and they're working their way up through the house level by level. The floating talismans pulsed more brightly, and the skittering sounds intensified in response. Whatever was living in Marek's walls was definitely reacting to the presence of Vaelor's artifacts. They're drawn to the talismans specifically, Elowen realized. That's why your infestation started after you acquired yours. Precisely, and now that there are two talismans in the same location, they're becoming bolder. I expect they'll try to break into this study before the night is through. Marek pulled a small crossbow from behind his desk and began loading it with bolts that glowed with pale blue energy. Are you prepared to help me deal with them? Elowen considered her options. She had lived her entire life in harmony with the natural world, but these creatures sounded like perversions of their original nature, transformed by magical forces into something hostile and dangerous. If helping Marek was the price of gaining access to the second talisman, she would need to find the courage to face whatever lurked in the depths of his house. Tell me what you need me to do, she said, and was rewarded by Marek's approving nod. We go down to the cellar, find their nest, and eliminate the source of the problem. The magical rats are organized around a queen, probably grown to enormous size by now. Kill her, and the rest will scatter. He handed her a second crossbow and a quiver of the enchanted bolts. Stay close, watch the shadows, and remember that these things are smart enough to set traps. As they prepared to descend into the lower levels of the house, Elowen felt the talisman's pulse quicken against her heart. Whatever ancient purpose had brought her to this moment was about to demand more of her than she had ever imagined, and she could only hope that the forest wisdom that had sustained her for so long would prove adequate for the challenges ahead. The cellar stairs creaked ominously as they began their descent into darkness, and from somewhere in the shadows below came the sound of many creatures stirring to meet them. The cellar of Marek's house stretched deeper underground than seemed possible, its stone walls glistening with moisture and strange phosphorescent growths that provided patches of sickly illumination. Elowen followed close behind the alchemist, her crossbow held ready as they navigated between towering shelves of alchemical supplies and storage containers that had been torn open and ransacked by clawed hands. The skittering sounds grew louder as they progressed, accompanied by chittering communications that suggested intelligence far beyond ordinary rodents. Elowen caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, sleek forms darting between shadows, eyes that glowed with unnatural brightness, and the occasional flash of teeth grown too large for their original purpose. "There," Marek whispered, pointing toward the far end of the cellar where an archway led into what must once have been a wine vault. The space beyond was filled with the rustling sounds of many creatures moving together, and a putrid smell that made both of them cover their noses with their free hands. As they approached the archway, Elowen felt the talisman's pulse quicken dramatically. The magical emanations from Vaelor's artifact were definitely attracting these transformed creatures, drawing them like moths to flame, but with hunger rather than simple fascination. The wine vault had been completely transformed into a nest. What had once been orderly rows of bottle racks was now a maze of chewed wood, shredded fabric, and bones from various small creatures that had served as food. At the center of this chaotic arrangement sat the queen rat, grown to the size of a large dog and possessed of an intelligence that gleamed malevolently in her oversized eyes. She was surrounded by dozens of her offspring, each one larger than a normal rat and marked with patches of fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When the queen noticed the two humans standing at the entrance to her domain, she reared up on her hind legs and released a shriek that was answered immediately by every creature in the nest. "Now would be good," Marek muttered, raising his crossbow as the entire colony of magical rats began flowing toward them like a chittering tide. Elowen fired her first bolt into the mass of approaching creatures, watching as the enchanted projectile struck one of the larger specimens and sent crackling blue energy through its body. The rat collapsed, twitching, but three more immediately took its place in the charge. The battle was fierce but brief. The magical bolts proved highly effective against the transformed creatures, disrupting whatever arcane forces had changed them and returning them to their natural state, which meant immediate death for beings whose bodies had been stretched far beyond normal limits by the magical influences they had absorbed. The queen rat proved more resilient, requiring several direct hits before she finally collapsed in the center of her ruined nest. As she died, her final shriek seemed to release something into the air, a dissipating cloud of dark energy that had been binding the colony together through shared magical corruption. The surviving rats immediately began fleeing in all directions, seeking exits from the cellar with the desperate urgency of creatures whose unnatural enhancement had suddenly been stripped away. Within minutes, the nest was empty, except for the bodies of those who had been too changed to survive without their magical augmentation. "Well done," Marek said, lowering his crossbow and surveying the destruction. "I've been dealing with this problem for weeks. Having a partner made all the difference." Elowen felt no satisfaction in the necessary violence. The rats had been victims of magical corruption rather than naturally evil creatures, transformed against their nature by forces they could not understand or resist. It reminded her uncomfortably that the talismans carried powers that could affect the world in ways both wondrous and terrible. This is what happens when ancient magic awakens without guidance. she said quietly. How many other creatures might be affected as the talismans grow stronger? A sobering thought, Marek agreed. All the more reason to understand what we're dealing with before the situation escalates further. They returned to the upper levels of the house, where the two talismans were still orbiting each other in their mesmerizing dance of light. The artifacts seemed calmer now, their pulsing more regular, as if the elimination of the corrupted creatures had removed some source of disturbance. I'll keep my word, Marek said, carefully taking his talisman from its floating position and wrapping it in a cloth similar to Elowen's. If you're determined to find the third piece, I'll help you locate this goblin script, but I want to be part of whatever comes next. These artifacts are too dangerous to be handled by one person alone. Elowen nodded, grateful for the partnership. The forest had taught her the value of cooperation and mutual support, lessons that seemed even more relevant when dealing with powers beyond normal human experience. They spent the evening in Marek's study, poring over maps of the deep forest and historical accounts of the area where Keltan the treasure hunter had disappeared. The region was known for its ancient ruins, remnants of settlements that predated human civilization in this part of the world, now overgrown and claimed by the wild creatures that thrived in magically saturated environments. Skrit's territory would be somewhere in this area, Marek said, pointing to a section of the map marked with symbols indicating dangerous wildlife and unstable magical phenomena. Goblins prefer ruins with multiple levels and hidden passages, places where they can retreat if threatened, but also store their collections of interesting objects. How do we approach a goblin who has spent a century avoiding human contact? Elowen asked. Especially if we want to convince him to give up something he's probably quite proud of owning. Very carefully, Marek replied. Goblins respect cunning and fair exchange, but they have long memories for insults or betrayals. We'll need to offer him something valuable in return, and we'll need to prove that we're not just another pair of treasure hunters looking for easy profit. They prepared for the journey methodically, gathering supplies for several days of forest travel and selecting items from Marek's collection that might serve as trade goods. Rare alchemical components, small enchanted objects, and a few gems that had been imbued with useful magical properties. The trip back toward the deep forest took them along roads that grew progressively less traveled, then onto paths that were little more than game trails winding between ancient trees. Elowen found herself relaxing as they moved away from the city's crowded energy and back into the natural world where she felt most comfortable navigating. Marek proved to be a capable travel companion despite his urban background. He had spent years collecting specimens and components in wild places, and his experience with magical creatures had taught him to move quietly and observe carefully before acting. The ruins they sought were located in a part of the forest where the trees grew larger and older than anywhere else, their massive trunks creating cathedral-like spaces between their spreading roots. Ancient stone foundations emerged from the forest floor like sleeping giants, covered with moss and lichen, but still recognizably the work of intelligent builders. There, Elowen said, pointing to a partially collapsed tower that showed signs of recent modification. New wooden structures built within the old stone framework and paths that had been cleared of undergrowth. Someone has been maintaining this place. They approached cautiously, aware that goblins were notorious for setting traps around their territories. The paths proved to be safe enough, but Elowen noticed several concealed pits and snares positioned to catch anyone who strayed from the designated routes. A voice called out to them when they were still 50 yards from the tower's entrance, high-pitched and speaking in accented but understandable human language. "Stop there, surface dwellers. State your business in Skrit's domain, or find yourself somewhere else to wander." "We come seeking trade," Marek called back, following goblin protocols he had learned from previous encounters. "We offer fair exchange for fair exchange, and knowledge for knowledge." A figure emerged from concealment behind one of the ruined walls, small and wiry, with the pointed ears and sharp features typical of forest goblins. He wore clothing that appeared to be assembled from dozens of different sources, all of it well maintained but clearly chosen more for function than appearance. "Trade?" Skrit asked, his bright yellow eyes examining them with obvious suspicion. What could city folk want from old Skrit that they cannot buy in their fancy shops? "We seek an artifact that came into your possession long ago," Elowen said, stepping forward and offering a respectful bow. "Something that belonged to a human treasure hunter named Kelton." Skrit's expression shifted immediately, suspicion mixing with interest and what might have been old grief. "Kelton?" "Yes, Skrit remembers Kelton. Good man for a surface dweller. Died badly in the deep ruins, trying to reach things that should stay lost." "We're sorry for your loss," Elowen said, recognizing genuine emotion in the goblin's voice. "He was your friend. More than friend, partner for many seasons, shared dangers, shared discoveries." Skrit's eyes hardened. "Shared the curse that killed him in the end. You come here asking for the thing that brought him to his death. Why should Skrit give such a burden to new people?" Marek stepped forward, carefully withdrawing his wrapped talisman. "Because we already carry part of that burden, and we believe the only way to resolve it safely is to complete what was begun long ago." Skrit's eyes widened as he sensed the magical emanations from the concealed artifact. "You have one of the godstones, and she has another." His gaze shifted to Elowen with new respect. "The three wake together after sleeping for so long." Skrit felt his peace stirring, but did not understand why. "Will you show it to us?" Elowen asked. "We don't seek to take it by force or trickery. We want to understand what we're all involved in." Skrit studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come. But touch nothing. Take nothing. Disturb nothing. Skrit's collection is not for clumsy surface dwellers to pore through." The interior of the ruined tower had been transformed into a remarkable living space and museum. Skrit had built multiple levels of walkways and platforms within the original stone structure, creating rooms and storage areas connected by rope bridges and climbing nets. Every available surface displayed objects from his decades of collecting, everything from ancient coins to preserved specimens of extinct magical creatures. He led them up a winding staircase to his most private chamber, where the most valuable items in his collection were kept behind protective barriers and warning signs. In the center of the room, floating within a cage of woven silver wire was the third talisman. This one was carved from red stone that seemed to pulse like a beating heart, and the moment it sensed the proximity of its two companions, all three artifacts began resonating with harmonized energy that made the air itself seem to thicken and vibrate. "Beautiful and terrible," Skrit said quietly. Kelton died trying to understand what it wanted from him. Skrit has spent 100 years keeping it safe, waiting for someone to come who might know what to do with such a thing. The three talismans pulled toward each other with increasing force, straining against the barriers that kept them separated. Elowen could feel the power building between them, a potential energy that promised both creation and destruction, depending on how it was channeled. "There's something else you need to see," Skrit said, leading them to another part of his collection. Here, preserved in a crystal case, was a journal written in Kelton's careful handwriting. He found the location of the god's temple before the curse took him, drew maps, made notes, even planned the route to reach it safely. Elowen examined the journal pages through the crystal, her heart racing as she recognized landmarks from her own forest territory. The temple was not some distant ruin. It was less than a day's travel from her own cottage, hidden in a part of the woods she had walked past countless times without realizing what lay concealed there. "The temple calls to its keys," Marek observed, studying the maps with growing understanding. "That's why your talisman appeared in Elowen's pond, so close to where it needed to be. The ancient magic is drawing everything together." "Will you come with us?" Elowen asked Skrit directly. "You knew Keltan. You understand the dangers involved. We could use your guidance." The goblin was quiet for several minutes, staring at the three resonating talismans with an expression of deep internal conflict. Kelton made Skrit promise something in his final moments, made him swear to keep the god stone safe until someone came who could use it to heal old wounds instead of opening new ones. He looked directly at Elowen. "You have the feel of a healer, forest woman, not someone who seeks power for its own name. Sake." "I only want to understand what's happening," Elowen replied honestly. "These artifacts have changed my life completely. I need to know what they're asking of me." "Then Skrit will come, will guide you to the temple and help you face whatever waits there. But the god stones travel separately until we reach the sacred ground. Together they are too strong, too eager to complete their purpose." They spent the night in Skrit's tower, preparing for what all three companions understood would be a journey into the unknown. The goblin shared stories of Kelton's research, describing the careful scholar who had spent years piecing together fragments of Vaelor's history before finally attempting to reach the sealed temple. "He believed the god was trapped there," Skrit explained as they sat around a small fire in his main chamber. "Not dead, not sleeping, but held between life and death, waiting for someone to make a choice about his fate. The sealing was not meant to be permanent, only long enough for the right people to find the wisdom to use such power responsibly." "And if we make the wrong choice," Marek asked, "then the god wakes angry, or the god dies completely, or the balance of the world shifts in ways no one can predict." Skrit stirred the fire with a charred stick, sending sparks dancing up into the darkness. No small responsibility for three people who found each other by chance. Not chance, Elowen said quietly, feeling the truth of the words as she spoke them. We were brought together by the same forces that hid the temple and scattered the talismans. We are exactly who we're supposed to be for this moment. The journey to the temple location took most of the following day, leading them through parts of the forest that Elowen knew well but had never explored thoroughly. Skrit proved to be an excellent guide, able to read the subtle signs in stone and vegetation that indicated the presence of ancient magical workings. The temple itself was hidden beneath what appeared to be a natural hill covered with old-growth trees. Only when they approached from the correct angle did the concealed entrance become visible. A doorway carved into living rock and sealed with a barrier that looked like solid stone but felt permeable to touch. The three keys together, Skrit said, his voice hushed with reverence and apprehension. Once the sealing is broken, there will be no way to undo what follows. Elowen, Marek, and Skrit each held one of the talismans, and as they approached the sealed door, the artifacts began to glow more brightly than ever before. The barrier recognized their presence, shimmering like water disturbed by wind, and gradually became transparent enough to pass through. The interior of the temple was a single vast chamber, its walls covered with murals that told the story of Vaelor's sacrifice. The images showed the god willingly entering into a state of suspended existence, holding back some catastrophic force that threatened to tear reality apart through its hunger for absolute order or absolute chaos. At the center of the chamber stood a figure that might have been a statue or might have been something more, tall and graceful, carved from stone that seemed to breathe with inner light. As the three companions approached with their glowing talismans, the figure's eyes opened, revealing depths of starlight and ancient wisdom. "You have come," Vaelor said, his voice echoing strangely in the sacred space. "After so long, the keys have found their way home, and mortals have found the courage to face the choice I could not make alone." "What choice?" Elowen asked, stepping forward with her talisman held out like an offering. "Whether to restore the balance by releasing me back into the world, with all the changes that would bring, or to let me fade completely, trusting that mortals have grown wise enough to maintain the equilibrium without divine intervention." The god's expression was both sad and hopeful. "I have held the line between order and chaos for 3,000 years, but such a position cannot be maintained forever." The three talismans rose from their bearers' hands, orbiting around Vaelor's suspended form in patterns that seemed to map the fundamental forces of reality itself. Each pulse of light from the artifacts corresponded to some aspect of the choice being offered: creation and destruction, growth and stability, known certainty and mysterious possibility. "If we choose to release you," Marek asked, "what happens to the world we know?" "It changes, as all things must change to remain alive. The magic that has been carefully controlled and channeled would flow more freely. Creatures like those corrupted rats would become more common, but so would wonders that have been impossible under the current restrictions." Vaelor's voice carried no judgment, only patient explanation. "I would resume my role as guardian of thresholds, helping mortals navigate the spaces between certainty and mystery. And if we choose to let you fade, Elowen asked, then the responsibility becomes entirely mortal. You would need to develop new ways of maintaining balance, new institutions and wisdom traditions to replace what divine oversight has provided. It would be harder in many ways, but it would also be entirely your own achievement. Skrit spoke up from beside the temple murals. What did you want when you chose this suspension? What was your hope for how this moment would unfold? I wanted mortals to become wise enough to make their own choice freely, based on understanding rather than fear or desire for power. The gods smiled, and starlight seemed to dance in the air around them. You three represent different aspects of that wisdom: connection to natural harmony, scholarly knowledge of magical principles, and respect for the accumulated experience of ages. Together, you embody the balance I have tried to maintain alone. The talismans orbiting grew faster, and Elowen could feel the moment of choice approaching, like a tide that could no longer be held back. But as she looked at her two companions, she realized that the decision had already been made, written in the very manner of their coming together. "We choose both," she said, speaking for all three of them. "We choose to let you complete your sacrifice by fading, but we also choose to carry forward the wisdom you've preserved. The balance will be maintained through cooperation rather than divine intervention." Vaelor's expression filled with something that might have been relief. "A wise choice and a brave one. The talismans will dissolve, their power returning to the natural flows of magic throughout the world. But they leave behind the knowledge of how to work together across different traditions and perspectives." The god's form began to fade, becoming translucent as the talisman's light grew brighter and more diffuse. "Thank you for giving me the gift of a meaningful ending, and for accepting the responsibility of a truly free beginning." The temple filled with gentle radiance as 3,000 years of suspended divine power released itself back into the world in carefully controlled waves. Elowen felt the change like warm rain after a long drought, refreshing and revitalizing without overwhelming the delicate ecosystems that had grown up around its absence. When the light faded, they stood in an empty chamber whose murals now showed new scenes, images of cooperation between different peoples, of wisdom shared across cultural boundaries, and of balance maintained through conscious choice rather than imposed authority. The three talismans had become dust that sparkled briefly in their hands before being carried away on air currents that would distribute their essence throughout the world. But each of the three companions carried something new within themselves, a deeper understanding of their connection to the forces that shaped reality, and a commitment to using that understanding in service of the greater good. They emerged from the collapsing temple as the sun was setting through the forest canopy, painting the ancient trees in shades of gold and amber. The world looked the same as it had that morning, but it felt different, more alive, more full of potential, more dependent on conscious choices made by people who understood the consequences of their actions. "What happens now?" Marek asked as they made their way back through the forest paths. "Now we go home," Elowen replied, already anticipating the peace of her cottage by the pond. "And we remember what we've learned and we share it with others when the time is right. And we stay in touch, Skrit added with a grin that showed his pointed teeth. The god stones may be gone, but the friendship they brought together should not fade so easily. They travelled together until the paths diverged toward their different homes, then parted, with promises to meet again and continue the work of maintaining balance through cooperation and shared wisdom. Elowen walked the final miles alone, through familiar forest paths that seemed to welcome her return while acknowledging the changes she carried within herself. Her cottage stood exactly as she had left it, surrounded by wild flowers and climbing ivy, with the peaceful pond reflecting the first stars of evening. But as she settled into her comfortable chair and looked out over the water where her great adventure had begun, Elowen knew that her solitary life had been transformed into something larger. She was no longer just a woman who lived quietly in the forest. She was a guardian of balance, a keeper of ancient wisdom, and a bridge between the natural world and the human communities that depended on understanding their place within larger patterns of meaning. The pond rippled gently in the evening breeze, and Elowen smiled as she prepared her fishing line for the night's catch. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use what she had learned, new chances to help maintain the delicate equilibrium that now depended on mortal wisdom rather than divine intervention. But tonight, she would fish in peaceful waters and give thanks for the strange journey that had led her to understand her true purpose in the world.